This is Run with Fitpage, your audio encyclopedia for all things running. Learn, train, improve. And now your host, Vikas Singh.
This is episode 4 of Run with Fitpage. Today, we are in conversation with Astrid Naranjo. Astrid is a clinical registered dietitian and is based in Australia. She works at Southport Private Hospital on the Gold Coast and is an academician at Clean Health Fitness Institute. Her nutrition specialties include diet design for fat loss, binge eating, creating healthier relationships with food, metabolic syndrome, women's health including PCOS, and overall well-being. We would focus on nutrition from a beginner's perspective and include an introduction to nutrition, key nutrients and their roles, the role of water and supplements. We will also spend some time on discussing how to set realistic nutrition goals. Let us welcome Astrid to the show. Astrid, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Today, we wanted to cover all about beginners' nutrition needs, and we thought who better than you to come and speak with us on this platform. So let me start by asking you the first question. What is nutrition for everybody? What role does it play for the human body and its basic functioning? What are macros and micros? So if we start to capture answers around that, that will be great.
Yes, absolutely. So to ask the right question would be, what would be the role of nutrition in health, well-being, performance? Because we need to be more specific when we talk about nutrition, because nutrition in general is just a way we nourish our body, as we cannot make a lot of things by ourselves. So we need to get it from our diet. So essentially is obtaining different nutrients that our body needs to pretty much perform essential functions that your body does on a daily basis to survive, to keep you doing the things you do on a daily basis. So when we actually start narrowing that down to understand what nutrition is, we need to think about what the role of nutrition would be in terms of health, well-being, and performance. So then we need to sort of making it very simple is to think about what we define by being optimal. So because when we talk about nutrition, it could be something that is very poorly done or decently well done or optimally well done. So when we look at this, we want to really think about that a balanced and optimal nutrition will provide you with the essential nutrients that your body needs for each relevant stage of life. For example, it's not the same to look at the requirements of a baby as we compare the requirements of someone who is in adolescence, or a pregnant woman, or an elderly, or someone who is around midlife age. So we need, when we think about this more specifically, then our requirements will change, and therefore it is going to be smart to think about. We need to talk about specifically what our body requires at that particular point in time. So being healthy requires to look at the balance of the different type and amount of each nutrient, and the food we eat generally provides and plays an important role in our bodies in many different ways. So from one of those being more importantly in this podcast, it would be to talk about performance and health and well-being. So then when we think about that, we look at long-term health, prevention of chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So basically that's what it is. And when we look at the foods we eat and the nutrients, we really think about all the environmental factors that could affect our growth, development, functional abilities, and of course our health. So basically, foods should be aiming to, the foods we eat should aim for improving our immunity, enhance our development, our growth, if we're looking at the full pathway of life, since you're little until you are elderly, manage and prevent any specific deficiencies, and reduce mortality and prevent like diseases that you can prevent from managing lifestyle and
Yeah.
diet.
No, I think it is a great summation. You talked about an important point, essential nutrients. I wanted to request if you could spend a little more time on discussing about these. Are there essential macronutrients, micronutrients, and anything else? Honestly, your point about specifying who is it for is extremely important. So let's take an example of an average adult who is possibly sedentary, who wants to get started on a fitness journey, does not have any major ailments, etc. But before we get to that, let us start by understanding basics and details of essential nutrients first.
Yeah, so essential nutrients are any element from the diet that your body is probably unable to make itself. So that's the simplest I can put it to you. If your body cannot make it in adequate quantities, or it might not be able to even produce it, then it becomes essential for your diet to get it from food. So that's what it is. Specifying when you need these essential nutrients obviously it depends on the stage of life that we just discussed about. For the general population, when we look at the average adult, we gotta think about even more specifically, are we talking about women? Are we talking about men? Are we talking about specific situations in life? Because we can have someone who is perfectly healthy or someone who is not very healthy and is around the same age. Or perhaps they are the same, they are in very good conditions, but one is overweight and someone else, and the other person is very lean. So when we think about all these different factors with that playing a role into defining what specifically is going to be necessary for each person, we need to think about what would be roughly the average. And for that roughly average, there are specifications in dietary guidelines of each specific macronutrient and micronutrient and what you should be aiming for specifically. So I would spend like an hour just telling you every single of micronutrients that you would need to be aiming for. But in a general rule, there are certain guidelines that you can follow, the dietary guidelines that generally recommend to have a specific amounts of or ranges that you can aim for in terms of macronutrients. For example, how much carbohydrate you should be aiming for in your diet, how much protein, how much fat. So this is all overlaid in specifically in dietary guidelines. And you can use that as a guideline, but when we go into a very specific of an individual, that things can change according to the person's needs.
You talked about carbohydrates, protein, and fat. Do you think one is more important than the others? Do you want to spend some more time on talking about how each of these macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbs, play a very, very specific role for humans' body, optimal performance, etc., and why it just may not be a great idea to look at just one macronutrient and ignore the others?
Yeah, so we need to define macronutrients in the first place to understand where does this word come from if we want to make it very simple and understandable. And the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients is that macronutrients are needed in large quantities, and they obviously supply an important amount of energy, while micronutrients helps the body to unlock and utilize that energy. I guess this is a very important key that they have a difference in quantities, but also in the role they serve. Most of the times, macronutrients will really provide energy for the most part. So they will metabolize as ATP, as energy. But micronutrients, in the other hand, they play role of managing and like collaborating throughout the process of converting this fuel into energy. So they are like little workers in the factory that they have to play a role to make the whole factory work.
More like a support function. Do you think so?
Correct. When we look at the different macronutrients, we could say there are three major macronutrients, but there are other macronutrients as well that kind of add metabolizing energy as well, but they are not considered essential as such. So the three major are obviously protein, fat, and carbohydrate, but we also need to consider fiber and alcohol as one of as those that can add calories and can transform in energy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they might be essential to the diet as the word implies, essential. But it doesn't mean, like, for example, if we refer to fiber, it is not something that can make your diet optimal. So there are two separate definitions, but it is important to sort of mention all of them. Going into more specific detail, let me just define, just mention about protein. I start with protein. So protein basically is an essential macronutrient, and it is made of long chains of amino acids that folds into little tight bundles, and they can pretty much create and sort of get together and create complex molecules that have a specific roles in your body. So that means that they can be pretty much like a structural. Most of the times they play a role as a function that your body probably cannot make on its own. So looking at the structural roles, vision, transportation like hemoglobin and albumin, storage like myoglobin, digestion enzymes, signaling peptides or cytokines, membrane integrity, fuel like the branch amino acids, etc. So protein is like amazing. I think it is one of the macronutrients that it is essentially amazingly essential. And in addition to that, it is one of the most important and has so many roles. So would say that there is not an established upper limit on how much is too much protein, but you can always aim between 0.8 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Seems to be a reasonable target that you can aim for depending on your preferences and activity levels, health goals, and things like that. But generally, protein is one of those that, like if you're looking into fat loss or body composition, is one of the most important things you want to make sure you're not missing out of. Now, moving to, for example, moving to fats, we have that fats obviously encompasses a wide variety of molecules, from fatty acids to sterols, phospholipids, triglycerides. All of those are like a very, very broad category. Now, some of those can be considered essential to a number of body functions, and also can really define how important they can be into cell membranes, maintaining their integrity, all body functions in terms of creation of many hormones, major source of energy production. And actually, a good interesting fact is that the human brain is about 60% fat. So your brain needs fats to maintain its integrity. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I had no idea about it, honestly.
Yeah. So basically, that's what fats do. Obviously, fats are a tool when we consider like body composition as a main goal, but it's not necessarily something that you have to have a specific, very high level or very low level. Um, and it's an energy source that obviously you can manipulate in certain, if you have a specific body composition outcomes. Generally, you don't want to go less than 0.5%, 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. But generally, that's what you can do a little bit higher if you will, as long as you're controlling or like managing calories and carbohydrate intake. Now, the last one is carbohydrates. So when I talk about carbohydrates, I always refer as the macronutrient that seems to be blamed a lot for obesity and insulin resistance and like the bad guy in the story, but it's actually one of the primary energy sources in your body, and it has an important function of fueling your brain, fueling your system. And if you look at that, you have to look at carbs as starches or as well as complex carbohydrates. So they will have an important role in your body, and they will definitely be part of a lot of different foods that you consume. And people confuse that carbohydrates are only in potatoes and bread and pasta. But they forget that carbohydrates are also in fruit, in dairy, and in vegetables. So carbohydrates are everywhere. So it's more about looking at the amount, the frequency, and how much of that you eat on a regular basis. So yes, that's kind of a summary. I don't want to speak too much on my own, and then.
Thank you for this. This is detailed, specific, and makes a lot of sense. It is a lot of information to process, and that is the purpose of a meaningful discussion like this. So thanks again for this. I have a question about carbohydrate. Is there something like a good carb or bad carb? And are there any good sources or bad sources of carbohydrate? You talked about taking carbohydrate from the right sources. So what are some of those? Is it true that carb is the bad guy, or that is really not true? So let's spend some time around this and get the myths to rest.
So I don't like to talk about good or bad sources of carbohydrates. I think it is important to define, well, what is your health status? Are you a diabetic? Are you a healthy person? Are you trying to achieve a specific goal? And all carbohydrates can have a normal and a decent role in your body, and they are not necessarily meant to be inherently fattening or inherently bad for you. It just depends on the context where you put in. So if we look at complex carbohydrates, there's something that we call glycemic index, which means that some carbohydrates will be absorbed so fast that they will go into the bloodstream very quickly. So then you can see a big spike in response to the insulin and glucose levels in your blood because of this high glycemic carbohydrate. And we have low glycemic carbohydrates that, on the other hand, it means that they will take longer to be absorbed and get into your bloodstream. So you don't see a peak, but rather like a steady increase and a slowly increase of the blood glucose and insulin levels along the time. So you basically want to say is that when we think about or determine what the goal is, then is when we can see, well, is it risky to have high glycemic carbohydrates or low glycemic carbohydrates? Maybe not. It doesn't matter as much as the total calorie intake you have, your current body composition. Like, it's not the same as if you have 35% or 40% body fat as someone who is very, very lean, 50% body fat, and they are very active. So someone who is very, very active, very lean, their insulin sensitivity is pretty high. So there won't be probably much, the type of carbohydrates you eat is going to be very irrelevant at some extent, as opposed to someone who has a condition like insulin resistance or Hashimoto's or some kind of chronic condition where insulin can be compromised. Then you could say at that point that perhaps selecting better type of carbohydrates or distributing them throughout the day in a more evenly way, or selecting those that are higher fiber, lower glycemic index is going to be much beneficial for those. But it is so difficult to sort of pinpoint one specific recommendation when it comes to carbohydrates, because there is no one size fits all.
No, completely agree. Specificity is important. And so we will keep almost all our questions around absolute beginners who have almost sedentary lifestyle. So I have two questions. One question on carbohydrate and one on protein. First, on carbs. You talked about a protein consumption range between 0.8 gram to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight and 0.5 gram of fat per kilogram of body weight. Is there any generic range of how much carb one should take per day, like a daily guideline or something like that? I understand it may be a broad range, but what are the normal guidelines?
So with carbohydrates, like if we consider every single source of carbohydrate just mentioned before, that is not necessarily just breads or potatoes, but it's also fruit, it's also dairy, it's also your vegetables, then we can say that carbohydrates are in a decent amount of food groups. So we can say that carbohydrates could potentially range between 45 to 65% of total calorie intake, rather than just telling you per gram. Would say more on a base of acceptable macronutrient distribution range is going to be that percentage. So between 40% and 65%, that's what is recommended by dietary guidelines to aim for when it comes to the amount of carbohydrates you should be aiming in your diet. Whereas protein could range from 15% to 40% of your total calorie intake, and fat could be ranging from 20% to 35% of total calorie intake, with the exception of perhaps speaking about ketogenic diets where fats are going to be much higher than that.
Now, the question on protein. How should people increase their protein intake? And I would reiterate, this is again about beginners. So if someone has a pretty low protein intake, say 0.5 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight, how should they look to progress as they get started to increase their intake?
Yeah, for me, someone who's trying to increase protein, you gotta be realistic and see what the person's goal and current situation is, and also what is it that their current intake of protein. Like you mentioned, if someone is about eating 65 grams of protein a day, if you're a really good coach, you won't tell them to eat 200 grams of protein straight away, because that's obviously something that is not going to be realistic for the person, and it can be very daunting and stressful, especially if you're not used to or you don't even know much of what are your protein sources. So you gotta create education and awareness of what are some of the sources of protein. How can you manage to eat a little bit more, whether it is from whole foods, eating more of it, or replacing some of the carbohydrates and fat sources for higher protein sources, or perhaps is adding a supplement like whey protein, as you mentioned before. That can be a very easy way to just add protein without adding carbohydrates or fats. And that can really allow you to reach your protein target. But in the sense of how to go about it, is try to go and set a realistic number based on their current body weight. For example, if the person is 65 kilograms and they currently eating about 65 grams of protein, that means they're eating roughly about 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. So what you want to do is at least optimize it to get them to 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight. So that means at least let's aim for the first time as at 100 grams. So we're just adding a little bit of protein and see how you go. Once we master that amount and the person feels more proficient and more confident about adding more protein, then we can aim for a slightly higher protein target until we sort of get to the target we are aiming for in the first place. For example, your overarching goal with protein is to get to 2 grams per gram, 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But you start them at 1.2 to 1.5, and then you start upping up that number until you get to the 2 grams per kilogram body weight.
I like it. I would only add that people should look at where they are to find their baseline and gradually progress from there instead of just copying someone else, which may not be suitable to them. Once you know your current baseline and gradually progress from there, there is a higher chance that you will be able to keep up with it and not lose it on the way. Moving on again, Astrid, within protein, people have questions around whether they should equally split their protein throughout all their meals, say in 3 meals, 4 meals per day. Is there any outer limit of how much protein should they be consuming per meal, or should they just consume as much as they have access to or they want to?
Yeah, so with protein, it is a little bit nuanced, this concept of how many meals a day you should be having when it comes to protein distribution. And there's not really a set target. There's not much of a difference. I think it's much overrated, depending on the goal, though. So when it comes to general health, total protein is superior and most important than protein distribution. Now, when hypertrophy and muscle gain is the goal, perhaps the number of meals and protein distribution throughout the day gets to be a little bit more important, because then you're allowing or increasing the opportunities for your muscles to have a window of opportunity to build muscle. So I guess the point is what the goal is again. So I guess all my answers would come back to the same principle of depends on the goal. Like for some things and for some specific goals, protein or like the intervention might be not as important as for other things. So when it comes to protein, it is the same thing. Perhaps seems to be intuitive to think the better and the more times I have protein, the better. But that's only the case. That seems like research seems to support that only for the most part in hypertrophy and muscle gain, but not necessarily for health or fat loss, as long as you're hitting your total protein targets on a daily basis. The other thing is this sort of myth that comes that you cannot absorb more than 20 grams of protein a day. And this is obviously very common, but it is very wrong in the sense that maybe what they want to say is you cannot utilize more than 20 or 25 grams of protein a day for muscle protein synthesis per meal, sorry. And now we're talking that there is a synthetic rate that your body can only allow per fraction of time with a certain amount of protein that is coming from a meal. So if you ate 90 grams of protein in one sitting, probably all of those grams of protein are not going to the muscle. Out of that 90 grams, 25 grams to 30, depending on the size of the individual, that might go to muscle protein synthesis, and the rest of the protein will do something else. It is going to go to production of hormones, or to your bones, or to creating enzymes, or other roles that protein has in your body, but it's not going to go to muscle.
Yes, absolutely. Providing this broad framework is helpful. Thank you for that. We've now covered macronutrients extensively. How about we move towards water? Is there a generic guideline for people towards water consumption and how it helps? Is there a daily limit? And more importantly, is it water consumption that should be kept in mind, or fluid intake in general that matters?
Yeah, I think you need to think about rather than water, I would say more hydration levels. That is a better definition of what your body is actually about. So when we think about water or like bodily fluids and body composition, we know that like adipose, like if we separate the part of your body, the adipose tissue itself is not just fat. Actually, your adipose tissue or your fat cells contain 10 to 20% of water in the cell. So it's not only fat. Muscles, on the other hand, are made about 75% of water. So there is a tiny bit of muscle or like protein, and the other part of that, so that 75% extra, is water. So we could say that there is 2/3 of your body made of intracellular water, and 1/3 of your body water is extracellular. So it's outside the cells. Intracellular is the water inside the cells, and extracellular is the water outside the cells. So your body is like 60 to 5, between 50 and 60% of water in total. We are made of a lot of water. So what I mean by this is that when we think about hydration, hydration is essential for health and essential for life. So when we look at the opposite, which is dehydration, when there is not adequate amount of fluids in your body, we could say that even at 2% of dehydration in your body impairs physiological functions and performance. How can you know how much water is enough or how much fluid is enough? And this is a $100 million question, because it is very hard to predict exactly the amount of fluid you have to drink, especially from water. If you understand that water is not necessarily the only thing that provides or hydrates you. So when we look at fluids overall, then we can say how much of your diet is actually fluid without including water. And then we include water, then we're adding additional fluid to what you currently do eat. So if you have milk, or if you have protein shakes, and you have fruit and vegetables and soups and yogurt and things like that, all of that adds an important percentage of water or fluid to your diet. So that is something you have to look at before even you're thinking how much water you have to drink, because you could overdose it as well. Like you don't need to be drinking 10 gallons of water a day to go to a complete extreme, nor just drink 1 glass of water a day. So it is a little bit hard to determine how much, but one of the best things I generally tell my clients is to go about the color of their pee. Is the first thing, and perhaps use a regular guideline of how much you sweat, especially if we're looking at someone who is an athlete or someone who is running or exercising. So a good way to go about this is, how can we determine how much water do you lose when you sweat? Some people sweat a lot, and some people sweat very small amounts. So for those who sweat a lot, they will need more water than for those who don't sweat a lot. For someone who trains outdoors in a very humid environment, is going to need more water than someone who trains indoors. If we're talking about someone who not just sweats a lot, but also sweats a lot of salt through their sweat, they need to replace sodium as well with water. So that's why there are certain hydrolytes or specific sport hydration electrolytes drinks that you can utilize in addition to just drinking extra water during exercise. Hopefully that brings some clarifications and adds some light to it. But the point is, determine the amount of sweat, and the way you can do it is weigh yourself with the clothes, with whatever you're going to use for training before the session, and train and weigh yourself without taking clothes off or anything, on weigh yourself before and after. If you're going to weigh yourself ideally you want to not wear anything, so you can just pretty much look at the total body mass by itself without additional things. That is going to be more accurate. And then weigh yourself again after training and see the difference in weight loss. That weight loss, generally, depending on how much you sweat, can be from 500 grams to 3 kilos. So it really varies depending on the person and how much they sweat and how long you went for and train. Like someone who is like running a marathon, they can lose up to 4 kilos, 5 kilos if they didn't hydrate at all throughout the whole event.
Mm-hmm. So you covered that weighing naked before starting the workout and exactly after and right after working out covers the sweat rate. So the question is, during the workout, do you need to be consuming any fluids, water? Do you need to hydrate yourself or not?
Well, if you don't know how much you sweat, then you could do an experiment. So just go one day, and I'm going to determine, this is going to be experiments. I'm going to determine how much I sweat. So obviously, if you drink anything, you have to subtract it from the final weight. So if you weigh 60 kilos, and then after the exercise, you weigh 58. You lost 2 kilos in the whole thing. Let's say you were thirsty, you drank water, and you drank 500 grams. If that happens, it's actually, you have to subtract that from the final weight. Because if you weigh 60 and then you weigh at the end 58, but you drank 500 ml of water, that means that you lost those 500 on top of what you're weighing. So you actually lost 2.5 kilos in the whole thing.
So does that mean if they lost 2.5 kilos, they should be replenishing 2.5 kilos in the next workout, or they should be replenishing a percentage of that or something like that?
I think if you lose 2.5 kilos, that means that you're not hydrating enough. So you actually need to take into account the aim is that once you finalize your training session, you weigh roughly the same as when you started. If you're weighing less, that means that you're not hydrating well and you're probably dehydrated. So you could potentially optimize your training performance by drinking better and more. That's what it means. Obviously, if you didn't have an adequate strategy, you have to replenish that fluid after you train. It can be obviously throughout the day. It doesn't have to be necessarily straight away, because you don't want to consume like 5 liters of water in less than 10 minutes, because then you can die from that.
Understood very, very clearly. Thanks for that. It is going to be trial and error as well for a period of time for athletes to understand their bodies and figure out how much fluid they require. So they should keep trying and see what adapts to their bodies over a period of time. Okay, another question. How about drinking to thirst concept during workout? Does it work or does it really not work? Let's just try and spend some time around this as well.
It is hard to say, because generally when we think about drinking to thirst, it's hard, because most of the times when you are thirsty during exercise, that means you're already dehydrated somehow. And some of the performance is being already compromised. So you can't intuitively rely on your thirst levels to hydrate. That's why endurance athletes in special, they have to pre-plan their drinking opportunities. So place fluids along the routes, plan the routes and where they can pass through convenience stores, water fountains, determine what is the minimum they need to consume, at least to prevent any excessive dehydration. These kind of things you have to pay attention to without overdoing it, because it also can affect your performance if you drink too much fluid, or it affects your gastrointestinal, like if there's a beverage that you drink that results in gastrointestinal distress, that can affect also your performance. So it is a very delicate situation, but never just rely on your thirst to drink, especially if you're an athlete.
Okay, we covered enough about drinking to thirst not. Since this podcast is covering basic concepts of nutrition, it would be unfair to not talk about BMI. Let us understand from you what is BMI and if it really is important to people. Or should people look at beyond BMI and other health parameters? What, in your opinion, will matter?
Yeah. So the BMI by itself is something that we really need to understand as the body mass index, right? So it is a tool that it is utilized to determine what is the individual range of healthy weight versus her height. Now, it is a good starting point. I don't think it is useless, but it doesn't consider your age, your ethnicity, your gender, nor your body composition. So I think it is important to assess other things like waist measurements and other risk factors to have a much broader and clear picture of what the BMI is indicating. Because by itself, perhaps can be relatively adequate to determine metabolic health at the population level. So when you have a great range of people that you're assessing at once, and you want to have an average. But when we look at the individual level, you want to know body fat distribution, adipose tissue dysfunction. You want to know whether they have obesity related insulin resistance or cardiometabolic disease. We have to look at those things more in particular to understand that just the BMI by itself is not going to tell you much.
I agree that it could be a good start point, but there are a lot more things that you need to keep in mind to figure out. For example, what's your body composition looking like? What is your fat percentage? And a number of other things. But it definitely is a good start point. Okay. Moving ahead, I wanted your help in understanding the role of supplements for general public. And again, I'm not talking about the athletes here specifically, but more of general public. Should people try to get their nutrition needs through supplements that's available in the market? Should they pop supplemental pills, or they should look to consume whole foods in general? What is your general approach to this?
All right. So when we look at supplements, I think it is important to think that they are supplements, right? So they might not be able to do anything for you if you don't have the base of the foundation well established. So let's say the goal is weight loss. Then if you don't have a net calorie deficit, you probably won't lose weight if you just add supplements to that. But if you do comply with having an adequate calorie deficit, you look at the type, the macronutrient ratio, you have adequate amount of protein, your good quality foods, and then you add the supplements, then perhaps you're going to see that they're going to provide a much better effects on what you're trying to use it for.
It is a great point where you said supplements should be used as supplements and not as main meals. Using these in addition to meals when required is a better decision than solely relying on these. So far, we covered a lot on basics of nutrition, its role, macronutrients and micronutrients. We talked about water and supplements. To me, it seems like people may just now be ready to get a nutrition plan and get started. So, my question is going to be, say people are wanting to get on a nutrition plan, do you think quantification matters? And if they want to get started, to what degree quantification matters? Should they be counting all their calories that they are consuming or not? How should they approach if they are looking to get started? Some of the right ways, tips, and some of the not so right ways for beginners as they get started.
Yeah, so I don't think you need to measure everything you eat to lose weight, but it's definitely for sure that to lose weight you need a calorie deficit. So you calories count even if you don't want to count them. So obviously counting calories or macro tracking is very good to increase your awareness and knowledge on what you're currently putting in your mouth and what you're eating and the body and the composition of your nutrients that you're eating. But I think it has some limitations in certain individuals. Perhaps not everyone is ready to count macros, or some people they just don't like to do macro tracking. 65 years old wants to lose weight. They maybe not tech savvy to track macros in an app, but perhaps they can follow a meal plan. Or you can just pretty much modify some of the things they're currently eating and start monitoring how they go with some of these swaps and changes and adjust as they go. So continue monitoring the progress and adjust as the time pass by. So my point is that macro tracking gives you a very objective way to measure what are the strategies you're implementing, and it is easier for you to adjust as if you were just doing intermittent fasting or restricting a meal in a day or taking away a food group. They can allow you to create sort of a deficit, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that it's going to happen. If you were to say someone is going to do intermittent fasting and they are going to actually skip the breakfast and still 2 meals left they have in the day, they will create a deficit for sure and they will lose weight. But if they then, because they skipped breakfast, then they're so hungry, they are going to compensate for that meal that they didn't have. They will probably eat as much as if they had breakfast, and then they are not in a calorie deficit, they're not going to lose weight. And sometimes that can even trigger a binge eating disorder, which makes them eat more than what they would have done even if they didn't start it in the first place, an intermittent fasting approach, and they won't lose weight, but they will gain weight. So it is very difficult to say what is going to work best, but then it's when you assess what the person is looking for, what are their skills, what's their mindset like, how's the relationship with food, what's their lifestyle like, and from there you can assess what strategy or tool is going to be more effective for them.
Fair enough. To summarize this point, if you're going towards a goal, set up your milestones that are progressive and realistic in nature so that you are able to sustain for a longer period of time. I also like the example where you mentioned, Astrid, that if you're going to skip breakfast, while it may be helpful for you to lose weight in the near term, but it may not be sustainable because you'll be feeling hungry through the day and you may just be consuming more calories than you had set out to. Okay, we are almost nearing the end of our podcast today. Astrid, I wanted to ask you the last question from your experience as you have worked with a range of clients, starting from beginners to advanced athletes. What, in your opinion, are some of the nutrition tips that people could keep in mind in addition to what we discussed today so that they do not commit the same mistakes as a number of other people would have committed? What are some of those tips you would want to tell our listeners?
The first one would be try to have a realistic goal that is obviously attainable, sustainable, and it is not like just because you want to do something, you try to find the fastest way to get there. So be very mindful of something that could be realistic and sustainable, and see what is the best way to achieve that, and work based on your needs, not based on the experience of friends or family that because that work for them, then it is going to work for you. You got to be really mindful of how my personality like, what is going to work best for me, so that is going to be sustainable for me. Secondly, if you're going to try to lose weight, don't try to crash diet, or don't follow detox diet or 1200 calorie diet just because. Really pay attention to exercise and training. Don't just go to the gym and run, jump into a treadmill and run for 18 hours and 2 hours, 3 hours, but rather pay attention to resistance training, building muscle, and use the gym time to get stronger and get better, rather than going to the gym with the thought of I'm going to go to burn calories. It's not to go to burn calories, it's to get stronger. So that what should focus be. Manage your calorie expenditure mostly from your diet.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. I think we've covered a lot, and our listeners might want to refer to some of these over and again. I will put some of these details in the show notes as well. It was fantastic to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we will get to speak again in future soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'll hope to see you soon.
Thank you for listening. We have a lot more to offer on nutrition, training, and fitness. Check the Fitpage app or visit our website, fitpage.in.